Welcome, everyone. Today we're talking about brain aging, neurodegeneration, dementia, and how it impacts women. I am delighted to have with us for our conversation Dr. Sandra Barral Rodriguez. Dr. Barral is a neurogeneticist. She's an associate professor of neurogenetics at Columbia University Medical Center in New York. She holds appointments at the Gertrude and the Taub Institute for Research and Alzheimer's disease and the aging brain. She has done lots of research focused on genetics of cognitive aging, episodic memory, and dementia. And don't worry, she's going to explain to us what all that means. Right now, they're just words. Dr. Barral has published numerous studies investigating genetic factors contributing to memory performance and Alzheimer's disease and links between genes and memory function. So welcome, Dr. Barral.
Thank you.
We're very much looking forward to hearing all about the brain and dementia and most importantly, how it impacts women. But before we jump into learning about these topics, can you tell us a little bit about what is neurogenetics and what was your journey into the field and why you chose to specialize in neurogenetics?
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm very happy to be invited and talking to the audience about my research and the research that a lot of us are doing in the field of Alzheimer's. Regard to your question, so neurogenetics is a very specialized area within neurology, which is the science that studies the brain and diseases and processes associated with the brain and the aging in humans. And as the name says, it combines two different disciplines. One is neurology and the other one is genetics. And what it basically consists of is trying to study the role that genes play in these neurological diseases. So a lot of these diseases, most of them, including Alzheimer's, have a very important genetic component. So whatever you have inherited, your genes, your DNA, plays an important role on the risk that you have to develop the disease. So that's my area of expertise. The way I ended up being in this field is, of course, life. So I'm originally a biologist. I did my studies in the University of Santiago back in Spain. And then went to do a PhD in Spain too in forensics genetics, always in genetics. And then, once you complete your PhD studies, you have to have postdoctoral training. And my first one was in cardiology, and then I did another one. No, I did one in cardiology, and then I realized I was a little bit frustrated with the science in Spain, and it was my time and chance to try something else. I came here to the States, to New York, trying to learn something new, which was statistical genetics, which is basically the methodology that we use for these studies I told you about, neurogenetics. And while doing that, I met Dr. Mayo, who is now the chair of the neurology department here at Columbia. And he was building up his group in genetics. So he invited me over and I came here. So since then, I've been focused mostly in the study of neurology because he brought me here with him. I fall in love with this discipline. But again, in terms of scientifically, the methodology will be the same wherever the disease is. It's just very strong statistical approaches. What is important is what we call the phenotype, the disease. And since I'm a biologist and nature, that was very interesting for me. So that's my story.
We're very happy that you actually specialized because some of your research has discovered some wonderful things that we're going to talk about. First of all, how do genes affect the development of the nervous system, or do they affect the link between genes and memory? Is it you have good genes, so you're in luck. You have bad genes, you're not in luck. How does that work exactly?
Well, it's obviously a simplification. It's a little bit more complicated, and we don't really mechanistically know what is the way that genes influence memory. What do we know is memory is heritable, and when we say that a disease, or in this case, memory doesn't have to be a disease. There are plenty of people that gets to a very old age having a very good memory, preserved memory, and cognitively intact. And I have participants in our studies that's the case. When we say that it's heritable, it means that you can pass this on to the next generation. And that means that has to be because you have genes that pass on to the next generation. So the way that the genes influence memory is either promoting your memory, making your memory better, or actually declining your memory, making your memory worse. And that is clear, and that's been established by us and many other groups around the globe. What we don't really know is what is the inflection point in what that decline becomes a pathology, right? So what is clear is with age, and this is the higher risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, with age, your chances to have Alzheimer's are increased. So just there is a normal cognitive decline that is associated with age. And in that normal cognitive decline, genes are also involved, right? Because some people decline worse. We all have friends and family members that you see that, in 2 or 3 years, the decline is very obvious versus before. And some other people, as I say, goes into 90s, having a wonderful cognitive performance. So that's part of the aging process. And then at some point, and we do not understand, the whole field is trying to figure out what is exactly that triggers that change. I say, okay, now it's not longer a normal aging with these deficits. Now it's pathological, and now it's going to end up in an Alzheimer's disease. So genes are playing a role. You are born with your genes. So your genes are going to be with you the whole life, influencing many processes, including how tall you are, how much you weigh. We know all of this, right? The color of your eyes, your hair. So do also influence diseases and processes. But again, the mechanics of how exactly a particular gene influences, for good or for worse, your memory, we don't really know. We're just trying to figure out a big group of genes, and then that is kind of a pathway in the cell that, so it's really complicated, but that's what the research is trying to make clear, and of course there's a lot of more work to do.
You said something about the physiological brain. So there is, I guess, such a thing as a brain aging, meaning a healthy brain aging and an unhealthy brain aging. And I guess it would be biological brain age, meaning the physiological or the functional part of what we see is happening in the brain, versus the chronological brain age, which would be the number of years of an individual. So do we know if all humans' brain age in the same way? For example, women's brain and men's brain. What do we know about that?
No. So it's a huge variability, and when there's a variability in any process or any disease, the first thing is, if it's heritable, like I told you, then the first clue for us as a scientist is there are gene involved. And basically, when I think that there are gene involved, this is like starting a chain reaction process, because if I have a gene, I can try targeting that gene. I can try to develop drugs against that gene. So, this is how it's important. Now, it's a huge heterogeneity. The way people age is completely different. And you can see, you as an observer, not being a science, but a curious person, and you compare your memory to your friends in the same age group, and then you see your grandma and your grandpa, or even your parents that are getting older, and you start to realize, their memory is not as good as they used to be. So there's a huge heterogeneity. And then that also affects differences between the sexes, right? Men and women. Women, we live longer. And as I told you, the first and most important and strongest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease is aging. So because we live longer, we have higher chances to get the disease. And that's the case. We get Alzheimer's more than men. But that does not explain the whole picture where women have more Alzheimer's. It's not only because we live longer. And that's a very, very active field within the neurology community to try to understand why is that women have more Alzheimer's than men. And, there are thousands of different hypotheses and projects developing, trying to understand this. One important component, of course, and kind of obvious, is the hormonal changes women go through their whole life. Starting with menopause, that's a huge change in a woman's body. And obviously that's going to have some repercussions in not only your body, your brain, everything, right? We know there are very important psychological aspects of menopause and aging. And if not, talking about even surgical procedures. So that is one of the things. And of course, the other important factor that differentiates more women than versus men is all the socio-demographic conditions that women are. So we were recently in this, the American Foundation of Alzheimer's, talking about exactly this and raising the awareness of women are the primary caregivers of not only Alzheimer, any other patient in the household. Therefore, your burden is worse, and caregivers have high rates of many different conditions. So all of that, the fact that you have kids, so many things. So that's part of the research. But truly, again, there are so many unknowns in science, and the brain is a big unknown by itself, right? It's one of the organs that we don't know a lot about, and research is being a little bit behind in that sense because it's really complicated. And also there is like the connection of the brain to the rest of the body is complicated. Sorry, it's a very long answer, but yes, there's a huge heterogeneity in terms of how people progress over time in the aging process and decline of their faculties. When comparing women and men, it's a huge differences too.
So you touched on some things that I definitely want to get back to, especially the part where we know that Alzheimer's affects women disproportionately, and that's not just in the US, it's globally. But I'll come back to that because I do want to ask you a question that is sort of to maybe debunk a myth. Very often people say things like, oh, she's getting old, she keeps forgetting stuff. Or they'll say things like, oh, he keeps repeating the same thing, but that's just part of aging. What is the difference between forgetfulness, normal forgetfulness, versus actual dementia? When do we say it's one versus the other? And is it a common part of aging for us to have either?
Okay, as part of the aging process, let's call it healthy aging process, is decline in your faculties. And we're talking about mostly cognitive and functional faculties that a person has. So that is normal. The moment it's becoming pathological and maybe a clue for, maybe that's not, the aging, but you may have something else. So the ultimate answer to that is a neuropsychologist who do an evaluation of your cognitive performance and will determine whether your cognitive performance stays in standards or is actually declining. The same way we go to the doctor and they took our blood and say, wow, your cholesterol is out of the chart. So we can do something similar, right? Woof, your memory is not good. And that is becoming a diagnosis of some kind of dementia, and then it's just fine tuning because there are many types of dementia. So dementia is, as I say, the clinical diagnosis. The other diagnosis is an autopsy. But the clinical diagnosis nowadays is still, because this is very active area of research where we're trying to figure out other ways to diagnose that are a little bit more accurate. But it still is a neuropsychologist who complete an evaluation on you. So that evaluation involves both cognitive and function of your capability. You should be starting to be worried when this affects your life, daily life, right? When you're forgetful leads to a small domestic accident. That puts you in a dangerous situation. That is worrisome. Or functional, or you don't know how to do your financial accounts anymore. Things that you used to do, and all of a sudden you are not doing it, or you are having serious difficulties. And the truth is, people know when they are not okay. You know for more than someone, oh, it's okay, it's grandma is getting older. Grandma knows. Another thing is that grandma wants to admit it. But it's like, oh, this is not longer me getting old. This is me leaving the stove open and creating a fire. This is me. But in any case, I will say, when you're in the age range that is coinciding with Alzheimer's, and that for us is the late onset Alzheimer's, 65 and older, right? Let's put 70s and up. And if you start to be concerned, please go to a doctor. I mean, it's very easy. It doesn't, it's not painful. No one is gonna, blood you unless you wanna donate blood for our studies. It's just a very basic evaluation. And, I think unless you have a very strong reason to be against, I think whatever it is in life, the sooner the better, right? There is no real treatment. But there is things that you can do to try to palliate that. And it's important to know, because also you can plan ahead your life based on that. Because if it really is a cognitive decline, the best scenario is that you are going to plateau and it's not going to be worse. But that's the minority. The real scenario is it's going to get worse. So you may want to plan for that. Your family may want to plan for that. So again, my advice to everyone is when things start to be more than once and it really interacts with your daily life, where, you think about it, that you have to stop and think, wait, where I put these things? That is something that, and if you are surrounded by people who is telling you, I don't think this is okay, also take others into consideration, because then it's just a denial of your own situation.
You mentioned a little bit before, again, this Alzheimer's is disproportionately impacting women globally. And so you mentioned that, well, the first reason is age, and women live longer than men. That's part of the reason, but that's not the whole story, as you mentioned. Then we talked about hormones, which I want to get back to you on, because I do have some specific questions about that. But the other thing we talked about is, you mentioned women, for the most part, are the caregivers. Usually they're struggling between taking care of their own health, maybe caring for a loved one, maybe one with dementia, maybe another illness, or maybe not an illness, but just day-to-day, just regular day-to-day caregiving. And we know that studies have shown that caregiving is associated with high levels of stress. What do we know about how stress impacts brain aging and potentially cognitive function?
So stress is just another factor that puts your risk even higher than it should be, right? I think everyone understands the psychological part of stress, the anxiety, you can't sleep, you can't stop moving around, you're worried about everything. But physiologically, there is something going on with your brain. And you see the consequences of that, which is, you start to forget more, you are irritable, you just, all the things that I just mentioned. So there's something going on in your brain, and if your brain is under pressure, which means that affects all the neural connections, all your processes are going to be affected by that. So it's absolutely not a good thing to have, or a thing I try to minimize as much as possible. And that's why you have all these studies, as you mentioned, where you have these caregivers that when they are longitudinal studies. I follow up some of these caregivers, and at the beginning, the person is perfectly normal. And after a couple of years taking care of a demented patient, you see a cognitive decline in the caregiver. That's not, spurious, or that's a real thing. And that's one of the main reasons, probably, is the stress, right, associated with taking care of someone. And that's in the case that is an external caregiver. Now, you sum up that being, for example, your mom that you're taking care of. And then you have your whole house to take care of. You have kids, you have a husband. And most of us, thanks God, we are working women too. So you have your work on top of that. So the amount of stress that a woman is going through is just unbelievable. And, I don't think you have to be a scientist to understand that has to have a tremendous and detrimental effect in your brain that show up as cognitive decline and all of these different anxiety traits, which most of the time end in depression, having to be medicated. So it's terrible, right? And I think we need to be aware of that also, talking about this and women feeling okay saying it, that is stressful. And sometimes you just have to give up. I mean, you can't do everything. Maybe, your loved one is better in a facility with personnel that is trained to do so. But yes, I mean, it's a stress, even if it's not in the caregiver environment. There are many, even with animal models, the rats under stress perform much worse in any of the function or cognitive tests that they are doing. So definitely is a very detrimental to your brain.
Do you know if there's any studies that have looked at the kinds of stress that women go through versus what men? Because we're talking about why is it so disproportionate women to men? And we know that women do more of the caregiving in general, right? Generally speaking. So I'm wondering if there's any studies that have looked at that.
I mean, particularly that I read or I'm aware, no, but I'm sure there is because it's in all this, in the big field of Alzheimer research, there's a lot of scientists looking at all the psychological components, social components. So I'm sure when we talk about the hormones, usually this study is taking into account also all stressors, additional stressors that women have to go through. Now, as a statistician in our models, when you adjust your models, not being biased in your results, you add a lot of your factors that you believe they may influence your result. So I'm sure all these studies that are studying hormones take into consideration, how many kids you have, what is the workload that you do. It's not the same a woman that is stay-at-home mom. I mean, the work at home is probably worse than sometimes at the working place. So, but there are all these differences. So I'm sure there is plenty of studies looking specifically into all these factors and how combined may explain why women have more Alzheimer's than men.
And just to clarify, when we're talking about statistics that are taking into account and we adjust for them, what we're saying is that, for example, we know that women live longer than men, but we adjust for that to make all things equal. Exactly. That's what we're referring to, right?
So for another good example is when we do all this analysis, as I told you, I'm considering many different people at the same time looking, right, and trying to understand why these people is different in their memory, for example. All those analyses have to adjust for the fact that I told you age is important and everyone has different age. So, when you know things that influence what you're trying to understand, you have to be rigorous enough to acknowledge that I have to account for the fact that age.
You remove the biases, basically.
Exactly. Right. So you're sure that your result, I mean, there might be other factors you never think about, but at least the usual suspects are accounted for. So your results are correct.
Okay, so I want to ask you about, one of the factors we mentioned was hormones, and we talked about menopause when there's changes in the hormonal levels for women. But what about pregnancy and the hormonal changes that a woman goes through during her pregnancies throughout life? How does that impact?
Yeah, so again, this is a very active area of research. So this is still a lot of studies, and it's not really my area, so I'm not as knowledgeable as I can talk about it. But I know that when looking at pregnancies, it's not only important whether you have been pregnant or not, it's like how many kids you have, because obviously it's not going to be the same profile for a woman who has, like in all generations and some women today, who have 10 kids versus me that have one. Obviously, we didn't go through the same processes in life, right? And a body that went through 10 pregnancies, even in the best scenario case where all of them were successfully, whether it's natural or sexual, that's a body that has seen a lot of changes, right? And this is in a small period of time, because we don't have that much time either. So this is in a small period of 20 years that you go through 10 kids. That's like half of your life is being pregnant. So people are studying exactly how that impacts your risk for example, Alzheimer's. Is worse for a woman that went through 10 pregnancies or not? Is just one single pregnancy is enough to just completely unbalance your hormonal system? And then, what is the combined effect of having kids and then having menopause? What if your menopause is earlier than normal? What if it's late? What if it's right? So there are so many different factors that, again, it's a very new field. It's a fact that has been known for a long time, but never really addressed scientifically. And lately, it's just like it becomes more and more and more. And I think also it's because as a society, women have entered all these science fields and they want to answer their own questions. Now, why we have that? And mostly all of this research, no surprisingly enough, is led by women scientists. Obviously, there are men that also have the same curiosity, right? I mean, at the end of the day, they are our partners in life. So I don't really know. I don't think they know. It's just one of the many other hypotheses that the hormonal levels. And then there is all the social connotation of that. So there's a lot of sociologists, economic scientists looking at, all the other aspects that the biological science are not really taking care of, which is, as we said, what is the impact of women all of the sudden entering the workforce that has any impact on that, your risk for diseases, various, not exclusively aging, but, many other diseases associated with this. And at the end of the day, it's just like an adding stress factor, right? Because you ended up doing multiple things as a woman. So yeah, it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating, but again, very, very new research. So
before we leave the hormonal changes during pregnancy question, because I want to get to a different part of some stuff that you've researched, but do you know if there's a correlation between maternal age at childbirth and some of this brain degeneration, cognitive function, etc.?
Yeah, we did a research on that, and we look at the maternal age and the cognitive performance of the kids from those women. And we found that actually women that have their children later in life, those children perform better cognitively. And for some people, this is kind of counterintuitive, but there is a whole discussion in our paper, and others have reported similar results, and we all believe, because it's really difficult to prove, but we all believe that by having your kids later in life means that you're probably starting in a better position than when you're younger, meaning that economically, financially, you're probably more established. And we all know what is the impact that in your future success as a kid, right? That your mom can pay for good schools, good food, good everything. And also more mature women is women that usually have achieved success in the workplace, means that it's highly educated women, right? So those are moms that, like me, I have my kid when I was almost 37 years old. By then I had a PhD, I have already 2 postdoctorals, so highly educated. And I'm not some rare example. I have plenty of friends in the same boat. So you are highly educated, you are financially independent, you are mature enough, because all of that gives you kind of a maturity in life. So you pass all of that to your kids. So the chance of your children to be successful were compared to other women that didn't do that have kids at an early age, where, financially it's probably not as stable. By early age, having a kid, even if you have academically aspirations, kind of gonna be delayed or affected by having kids. Kids are really time-consuming creatures. So that's the results. And
I wanted to ask you something else because I was reading some of your published work, and there was something that you had studied that I saw called LOAD, late onset of Alzheimer's disease. Can you tell us a little bit of what is that and who's at risk?
So this is a very common thing that I get asked, and I'm happy that you asked me because it's a great opportunity to try to people to understand what's the difference. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, there are two forms of the disease. Most of the people, general public, when they talk about Alzheimer's disease, they are referring to this late onset Alzheimer's disease, right? When you're getting old, your memory is not the same, grandma is behaving a little difficult, and she's been diagnosed. So that's the late onset Alzheimer's disease. And arbitrarily, because we have to get methods to study diseases, we decided as a community of science that when you are 65 and older and you have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, we're going to call that late onset Alzheimer's disease. If you're younger than 5 years of age and you have Alzheimer's disease, then we call that early onset Alzheimer's disease. And that's the one that I think people do not know about that much. And when I say younger than 65, I'm talking about patients we have as young as 30 years old that have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Wow. That's in the diagnostic part of the disease. In the biological part of the disease, most likely there are not that many difference between the two of them, but this one that is the reason why this distinction is that for the early onset Alzheimer's disease, when you have the disease being really aged, 65 and younger, we know the genes. We know there are 3 genes, and we know if you have a mutation in that gene, you're gonna have the disease. Not only that, but you pass that gene to your children. So they have also a risk to have the disease. This is not different from breast cancer mutations in BRCA gene that probably people is more aware, women are more aware, right? When you have the diagnosis of a BRCA and women go and do mastectomies or famous Angelina.
Just to clarify, the BRCA is the gene that tells you that you're going to have
breast cancer, right? So similarly in Alzheimer's, we know there are 3 genes, and mutations in that genes cause you to have Alzheimer's that early. In the case of the late onset Alzheimer's disease, we have genes, but they are not mutations in the sense that they don't have this causal effect. The genes that we know increase your risk, but not necessarily you're going to have the disease. So one of these genes for the late version of the disease, late age version of Alzheimer's, and that is very common, known, and is available in many platforms now commercially when you do 23andMe and all these different genetic platforms, is called ApoE. It's a gene that is involved in Alzheimer's, and you test for that gene, and they'll give you the result of that gene. And even if you have that gene, they cannot guarantee, no one can guarantee that you're going to have the disease. And we have a lot of people, participants in studies that have that gene and still they're okay. So we call those risk factors because influences your risk, not necessarily, versus the other genes that I mentioned in the early version of the disease where, yes, you have the gene, I'm so sorry, it's like a lottery in life, you got it. I cannot tell you when in terms of which age, but definitely you're going to have Alzheimer's. And not only that, because it's genes, you pass them on. You have to take care of that because it's not only your decision any longer, it's also, your kids and what are you going to do with that information. So that's the late onset Alzheimer's disease. And that's the major difference between these two. And I work in both, but probably you read a lot more about the late onset Alzheimer's disease.
There are also lifestyle and environmental factors, right? So what do we mean when we say environmental factors? Can we define that for everyone, and how do they impact?
Environmental is actually a big category that involves a lot of different factors, but probably for our audience to understand, Environmental is considered, for example, smoking is an environmental factor, right? And that increases your risk for disease. Exercise is an environmental factor for, I guess, lack of a better word, right? So non-genetic factors maybe is a better word for it.
Diet?
Diet, absolutely. So demographic and sociological factors, where you live, what you eat is part of the diet that is unfortunately very determined by where you live and what is your salary, right? Because if you have financial stability, your chances to get better food are higher than someone that is not having that financial stability and have to resort to really not healthy food because it's the only option that you can afford. And then obviously all conditions that may affect also, there are some of them genetic, some other not, but most of the time when we talk is mostly smoking, exercise, alcohol, things like that. Pure environmental will be pollution, right? The exposure, the pollution, or is your exposure or to metals and things like that, but that's pure environmental. But we try to globalize everything, and then under the environmental is a lot of different factors that we know influence the risk of disease, but the genetics alone and the age, which again is the higher risk.
So there was one of the studies that you talked about, something that I found very interesting with regards to ethnic background factors. It was a episodic memory in multi-ethnic longitudinal study. Again, was associated with this late onset Alzheimer's disease, and it seemed to conclude that declining memory is one of the strongest predictors of incident dementia, and individuals that were characterized as decliners were likely to have non-white ethnic backgrounds, fewer years of education. Can you tell us about these findings, about this study?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the largest studies. I think today probably is the largest that has been published. So episodic memory is a type of memory that we have. And, this is the work of my colleagues, the neuropsychologists, that categorize the different types of memories and processes in your brain. But episodic memory is basically two different memories, what we call the immediate memory and the delay. And I think the best way to understand that is if you get the cognitive evaluation, I'm going to read you a little story. And once I finish the story, I'm going to ask you a few things about the story, right? So Maria went for a walk and found Janet, and they went to have a tea. Janet had a green tea, but Maria wanted a coffee. Nothing, like very short. And then ended up and said, okay, who Maria met? Did Maria have coffee or she had tea? Couple of questions, very basic. Unless you're extremely impaired, you're going to remember that. And then I keep going with my cognitive evaluation. This is part of a whole global evaluation. And then like 15 minutes later, I say, remember that story I told you? Tell me now what you remember, 15 minutes later. So that's the recall. Not only your ability to memorize things that I told you, your ability to retain them. And these are kind of different processes. So we combine them and we call that episodic memory. And we look at that longitudinally, it means like through the years, right? And we did it again in a multi-ethnic. That means we look at different ethnic groups. So as part of our studies, we have the white ethnic group. We normally call it non-Hispanic whites because there are Hispanics that are whites too. So trying to differentiate because genetically they are very different. We are all very different. So we have the white population, then we have the African American population, and then we have our Hispanic population. So we look at the difference between these three groups. Declining memory, and that's not a new finding, is one of the first hallmarks clinically of the disease. When your memory starts to go down, that is a sine qua non sign that you are having a neurodegenerative process. Most likely Alzheimer's, but there are other types of dementia. So that's not something that we just discovered. It's just kind of replicated. We again seen the same fact. what it was novel about this, apart from using so many different people, is the fact that we look at different ethnic groups and we saw the difference in the ethnic groups. And again, and this is something that is observed in the Alzheimer's too. When you have the disease, the same way that we were saying women have more Alzheimer than men. The same way, and I think this is not known by the general public, African Americans and Caribbean Hispanics, as the populations we study, have higher risk of Alzheimer's compared to the white population. Again, why is that? We don't fully understand it. But the same way, when you see at the people who decline over the years, much more are these groups too, which is a consequence of Alzheimer's disease. So no surprise that a lot of them and they are having Alzheimer's disease. And then there is another important factor that you just mentioned, and we did mention in the paper, that's the educational level. And there is something very important, and that's fact also that's been proved by one of our neurocognitive professors here, Jacob Stern, with this theory of cognitive research, which means that when you have better education, higher education, or you educate yourself, it's so important for the brain, because that is not that you're not going to have the disease. In the event that you have the disease, your education is going to act like a buffer. It's going to sponge that. And the way that the disease is going to affect you versus someone that doesn't have the same education is much better. So it really ameliorates the impact of the disease, your educational level. And that's so important because it's one of the few things that is actionable in this disease, right? Where you can actually have policy to be sure that that's not a factor anymore, that people have access to as much education as they want. The other important one is the diet, because not surprisingly, both communities that I'm talking about, both ethnic groups, both African Americans and Caribbeans, have also the highest risk of cardiovascular disease. These are people at risk for cardiac arrest, cardiac disease, hypertension, diabetes, you name it. So hand by hand, right? And that's something also kind of actionable. It depends on the diet, a little bit more complicated because it's entangled with the socioeconomic status of the person. So that's what we found. And I think, this is very important as a taking home message, and policy makers, that there are few things until we actually have a drug that works against Alzheimer's. These are things that we can really work and try to minimize as much as possible.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think, as you said, it's factors that are actionable, things that can be addressed. So I think that's the highlight of the studies that sort of put some of these things in evidence, which is important. Do you think that the education, is it just what it does to the development of the brain, or does it go beyond that in the sense of creating bigger awareness, more ability to look for things that may impact your overall health or your diet or things like that? Is it a combination of those things, or is there
a combination? So it's a biological mechanism for which education, and that's beyond my comprehension and my field, but it really affects neural networks in your brain. You should have a neuropsychologist talking about that, and I'll recommend Jaco. He'll explain beautifully. But more than that, again, it's so confounding education in your socioeconomic status, because people who have access to higher education, usually is your higher education, it gives you knowledge, right? So yes, you are way much more aware of everything around you. It also gives you access to health. Your access to health is way much easier, right, for someone with education, not only because you probably live in an area that the hospital is next door, but also because you know who you need to talk to. We are talking about, people already, we are biased even in our conversation. We say, oh, no, you go to the neurology or neuropsychologist. But now imagine that you feel that something is going on with your brain, but you even don't know who I'm talking to. who is the person who is responsible? You don't even know there is a science that is neuropsychology. You don't really even know there is a disease it's called Alzheimer's. So chances that, that goes past you because I don't even know how to address that. That's why I think it's so important, efforts like this, podcasts and public awareness. Yes, there's something that is called Alzheimer. And yes, there's plenty of people that can help you from the health point of view, psychologically, whatever you need. I mean, there are foundations like the Alzheimer's Association and the Foundation of America for Alzheimer that have great work trying to educate the public, trying to put resources available for families with people affected by Alzheimer's. But again, you have to have a little bit of education. That's why it's so important. It's not only the knowledge, the fact that is going to pretty much secure a good position in life in terms of, a house and everything. It's just like your knowledge of, where to go, who to talk to, who the people that that can put you in contact. I mean, it's just, and that's why I think, as a policy, is so important and still is not done sufficiently, right? I mean, there is a little scarcity to education in this country, and in some areas it's really hard to get to a good school.
This is part of the reason why we've started this podcast, is sort of to disseminate the information to as many people in a free form so that they can understand exactly what's out there, what's available to them. I want to ask you something else. I read an article recently regarding blood markers, and these are just blood tests for Alzheimer's. And first question is, are they accurate tests? And does it matter if you're male or female? Does your ethnic background matter, since we're talking about ethnic background?
Okay, so first of all, biomarkers. So we were talking about the diagnosis of the disease. So the clinical diagnosis nowadays, because this is not publicly available yet, it will be, that's the future, is you go to a neurologist and they'll send you to a neuropsychologist, they'll do a cognitive evaluation, and then in a conference between neurologists, neuropsychologists, and experts will decide whether you have Alzheimer's or not. So that's the way it's done at my center, right? Now, as you can see, that's really kind of very consuming. It requires a lot of expertise, time to revise every case, and in some places it's completely unfeasible. I mean, if you are diagnosed in the middle of a rural area here in the States or some other parts of the world. Not only that, but we do as good as we can, but we miss a lot. We miss a lot of people that maybe it's Alzheimer's, but we don't catch it in these cognitive evaluations, and which is what worrisome. We call normal to a lot of people that it's not. So alternatively, there is a few things that you can do. One is scan your brain, because we know, even if you are diagnosed with Alzheimer's now, 30 years early in your brain, you can see already. Because people have done that research, scanned people 30 years ago, and then when they have the disease and they see the difference, and they see already signs of the disease. And these are accumulations of proteins in your brain, the famous plaques and amyloids. So that's one way. So we can scan your brain and see if there is any of those brain signatures for the disease. And then, we consider you are probably, along with the clinical diagnosis, you probably are an Alzheimer's patient. But again, this requires a very specialized equipment. You have to have a scanner, which is not cheap, and then you have to have expertise, the people who does the radiology, and then it's not only neurologists, neuropsychologists, now you have radiologists. It's a big deal. Again, thinking about, we are not the only place in the world. There's a lot of people that don't have access to that. So the best way for us will be a blood test, right? Because people is used to get blood for cholesterol and other diseases. So what we can have a blood test for Alzheimer's disease. And that's what we are trying to do. And that's the biomarkers. Bio because it's from your blood, right? And in that, you're measuring different proteins, like you measure cholesterol. And that will indicate the higher levels of the proteins, which seems to be consistent with an Alzheimer's diagnosis. Now, where are these different? Of course, they are different. If they differ across ethnic backgrounds, of course. Do we know exactly how? No, because most of these studies start in whites. So we have to wait a little bit. And then, other ethnic groups started to be analyzed. Again, in these other minority groups, the access to all these technologies is pretty much impossible. And the men and women, I don't think there are so many differences in men and women as much as across ethnic groups, but maybe there are some differences, right? Because we know the disease is different in these two sexes. Yeah, so that's definitely the future. So we can, kind of dream of a future where you get to the office of your general practitioner, and as an annual test, will in the same way for women, when you reach some age, I don't know what is the threshold now, but it's like, oh, it's time for your mammogram every year. Well, you can envision that if you're 65 and older, your general practitioner is going to say, oh, let's do some blood biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease and things how are going. And along with that, with some genetics, we'll say, let's get some blood for doing your genetic analysis too. So I think that's going to be the future of this disease and probably many others. That's the way the healthcare is moving forward, right? Where you have a comprehensive evaluation of the patient.
So based on what you're saying, it sounds like we could conclude that there is a need for more gender-specific research to explore the biological and social factors at play. So in other words, more women need to be part of the research input. And as a matter of fact, it should be women of all ethnic groups, Hispanics, Black, white, Asian, etc., all need to be an integral part of that research cohort so that the conclusions can be made correctly for each gender, if you will, and for each ethnic group. Is that like a fair?
So so the more participation, the better, because more representative is gonna be the populations we study. And I encourage every single minority to participate in all these studies. Again, it's not usually a lot that is gonna be asked for you for studies like for genetics. It's a little bit of blood. There are more complicated ones where they want to study the brain imaging. Maybe they ask for an MRI. But more than that is also the consciousness of, in the other hand, us as a scientist, when you are trying to study your data, your projects, it's like, wait a second, ask the question, is there a difference? Whatever you're studying, is there a difference when I compare men and women? And that's very important, because as I said, up to now, there was no such a question. No, we treat like the same. And we also didn't question until more recently that, wait a second, but the world is not only white. There are a lot of other ethnic groups. Is this same across all these ethnic groups? So when you start to formulate those questions and you actually see there is a difference, I think it's more than up to us scientists, like, well, then I have to. I mean, it's my obligation as a scientist, professional and rigorous doing my science, to ask this question in my research, whatever your research is, right? Is there a difference? Oh, no, it's not. Fine. But not because I didn't look at. I did look at. And then obviously, so I guess it's a symbiosis, right? We need the participation of the as much representative as possible in the population. So women and minority women, and by minority, I mean populations that never look at, like all South America, that's more close to me. But there are thousands of populations that we have no idea. And then in the science part, it's like, I'm going to do my research and knowledge that this is a fact and I should look at it.
So it sounds like we women need to be part of the solution in order to get this information out and in the hands of the researchers so that they can correctly dissect it and tell us more about maybe targeted prevention strategies or treatments for women based on these factors. So as women and as women of different ethnic backgrounds, we need to be able to participate in providing this input. We are part of the solution.
Of course. Yeah. We are very much part of it, because as I said, and we say this, women that, because we survive most of the time, men, we live longer, we have higher chances of Alzheimer's disease, but we didn't talk about those women among those that live longer with these higher chances of Alzheimer's disease, and let me get you back to the concept that this is the late part of the disease, right? Not all of them have the Alzheimer's. So it's a substantial group of women that are older with the higher chances, and they're still good. So why? What the women have? So the more than we have, the more can I study and say, wait, this is the key. These women that, preserve their aging brain, they have the key for probably the solution for the disease, right? Or there is something in these women that is so particular that makes them completely escape their lottery. So there's something particularly interesting about you. So if I don't have that women, how am I going to study that? I need women, right? And for that purpose, men too. But again, in that age group, I don't have men. It's only us. So please, yes, participate as much as you can. And again, if you're from a minority, and we're talking about this whole efforts are to get to the point where we have a drug with the future generation. Okay, take this pill and, forget about Alzheimer's. If you want to have that pill for yourself, it's probably going to be slightly different from the pill from another woman that is from different background. So you better also participate, because then I can tailor the drug to you too. Otherwise, it's going to be for the one that I have already, which is the majority of these participants are white, right? So I want to see representation. I want to have other races, other ethnic backgrounds present in all these, not only my research, but then also in the companies when, they do the clinical trials. They need to be representative. The world is more heterogeneous than ever. So we need to account for the fact that I told you already, genetically we're different. So when you develop a drug, maybe you have to twist it a little bit, because it's not going to have the same effect in one ethnic group versus the other.
So what are some suggestions of where women who do want to volunteer for safe clinical trials or research projects, where could they go? Where do they begin to look for these? Do they just walk into a hospital and say, I'm here?
The best places will be, globally overall, resources like the Alzheimer's Foundation of America, Alzheimer's Association that have chapters in every single city in the States. Those are not only provides a lot of information and educational resources like videos and fact sheets about Alzheimer's and all of that. So that's a great resource. I encourage everyone. Alzheimer's Association is more scientifically oriented. The Foundation of America for Alzheimer's is also very pragmatical, right? So they have resources to help you to get to a home aid or whatever that you need. So encourage both of them. And then if you really want to research a little bit more in depth, I would suggest go to your major hospital in your area, right? So if you're living in New York, you have many hospitals. So you have our hospital, Columbia Medical Center, but you have Mount Sinai, Cornell. Each of these hospitals have a department of neurology, and the departments in their websites, in the internet, they usually have a section that is research. Under research, they will tell you what type of things they do, including whether they have clinical trials. What are the projects we're trying to get participants to working? Or you can, if you don't want to go through the whole ordeal of studying a little bit, just like contact the department and say, I'm very interested in, they'll put you right away, because we really want people to participate in research, right? So if you call up and say, I'm interested in donating my time and my blood for whatever project is related to Alzheimer's disease, we take everything. So yes, they put you in contact with a research coordinator. And if you want to participate in a clinical trial, you have to have some eligibility for that trial. Same as research, right? Some of our projects requires some minimal things that you need to be able to do in order to participate. But that person is dedicated to really point it out to the correct place for you. So I think those are great resources. And then anything that you can do to educate yourself in terms of, listening, podcasts, radios, TV shows. There's a lot of awareness now, movies, to educate yourself about how important it is. Research that has been done. There are tremendous documentaries about the genetics of Alzheimer's disease, the history of the disease. It's a good time because there's a lot of us investing our time and lives in trying to get a little bit better knowledge of this terrible disease because it's very terrible.
Yeah, maybe we'll put some links to some of these research areas and the Alzheimer's Association, things like that, so people watching or listening can then just come and click on the link or something so they can find more information. So I want to ask you a question. If you were given the authority and the means to change anything in your field of research as it pertains to how it may impact women's overall health or just the types of studies that you could do or the reach of the study that you could do, what would you change? What would you want to see changed?
Well, I think one of the things we want the most is diversity. I want to have more representation. I want to have people having projects in populations and ethnic groups that never had that, right? Because they don't have access, because it's difficult to get there. A lot of it is because it's infrastructure and logistic in these underdeveloped countries is so challenging. And, it's like why should I bother some of the researchers on going to remote Peru when I can be in Idaho? But the thing is, remote Peru, I was giving a talk to some high school yesterday because we have those populations and we're studying those. The Peruvians that nowadays move around in the world, they have the DNA of the Incas. The Mexicans that move around the world today, they have the DNA of the Mayas. And that I can go on with all this very native component of a lot of ethnic groups, which means that there is something in the Mayas that make them better for protecting them from Alzheimer's. Mexicans are going to have it. And unless we study Mexicans, I don't know about that. Or the same thing for Peru, or the same thing, from a lot of South American countries that are not studied at all. And again, I'm biased South America because I'm Spanish speaking, but, we can say the same thing for Africa. Because when we talk about Africans here, it's African Americans. It's a completely different ethnic group. It's mixed with the white population. I'm talking about Africans from Africa, right? All these countries in Africa, it's very difficult because a lot of logistics. What about Asia? What about India? What about all the islands in the world that no one touched? I mean, so I wish, we have the resources and because I think that for a lot of us, this is their desire. It's just like, who is gonna grant me the money to do that? No, I just wanna go, and spend like 3 months in South America traveling around getting DNA from all these very remote places. It's not sound like something that is going to be successful. So the funding agencies are very reluctant to do that. So I think that's the future where, science is really actual representative of the whole population, not that few of us. And then if that's my effort in the science part of it, I want to see that reciprocated in the companies where they are developing these drugs. Do it for everyone, not just do it for, some of them that they're going to be able to pay $200 for having a vacuum. I mean, there's people that is suffering. They don't have anything. So you need to make these drugs available to everyone. And when you design the drugs, you also need to take into consideration all these differences across different ethnicities. So that's my hope.
Yeah, personalized medicine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we're coming to our hour and I need to wrap things up. And we have a closing tradition on the podcast where you get to give us special advice. So I want to ask you if you could give one piece of advice to women in their 30s and their 60s, and we know that that barrier of Alzheimer's development is around 65, about brain health to help address this narrative on tackling this disproportion between men and women developing Alzheimer's and who's at risk, what would that advice be?
All right, so very different, right? For a woman in their 30s, this is very early, but again, yes, your mental health, your brain health starts way much earlier than 65. So if you're in your 30s, just I think the best you can do is try to be healthy, right? Because when you are healthy for your body, that repercutes in your brain. Educate yourself, read about your brain and things that you can do, right? Try to engage in things that are important for your brain lives. And, just take care of yourself. This is a process. Try not to stress, try to, at the same time to enjoy your 30. For a 65 years old, be vigilant. And if you see something that worries you, don't wait. Just go to the doctor, talk to your general practitioner, to the neurologist if you are worrying of let them to evaluate you. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just, something that you're stressing out about, but maybe it's something and you need to know. And, if that's the case, don't stress, don't, there's plenty of resources for you. There are plenty of people going through the same groups where you can talk to people about your feelings, the way that you wanna take this road and there are a lot of researchers that are happy to sit down with you and explain projects that you can collaborate, where you can participate. That makes you probably feel useful in the sense that, well, at least my disease is contributing to a better good. I find that for some people, that's really something that they're proud of, but to have the disease and be able to contribute to research. And again, I mean, it's just taking care too. So sometimes it's like, well, I'm too old. Do not ostracize. We tell old people here, our Hispanics that are lovely, our old Hispanic ladies, don't stay home watching the telenovela all day long. Go to the center, dance, go for a walk, get one of your friends, play domino, whatever makes you happy, socialize, being happy is also good for your brain. I'm going to close with this. This is very cool study that we saw one day in the Alzheimer's conference that we attend every year. And these are a Japanese company. I have the seals. Those are like puffy seals, like a toy with these very huge eyes, like super cute big eyes. And the eyes move and look at you. That's it. They didn't talk anything. So they started an experiment where they went to a home care with elderly people, some of them with Alzheimer's, some others not, but all of them in a facility, right? So one of the main problems is isolation and solitude of these people. And they gave them the seals. And then they tracked, and they saw that a lot of them decreases the use of antidepressants and medication because they love the seal. They're just hugging and they look in the eyes. And that's a seal, that's something inanimate. Imagine a friend or someone, that cross paths with you in the street. So it's so important. We are humans, we need each other. And if you don't have that network around you, again, all these associations, there are people out there that are willing and dying to help you out. I mean, I've met people that is so willing to dedicate themselves to help you and going through these difficult times, right? And then, we're working really hard in science, try to get into a place we can explain more to you and tell you more actionable things.
I love that seal story.
Yeah,
That's wonderful.
I mean, they did also try with kids, autistic kids, and it also proved to be fantastic. Again, it does not prevent diseases, but it reduced the overuse of medication because some of these patients were taking, sleeping pills, antidepressants, a lot, and they saw it's just they did the science out of it. They started to incorporate in every single residence in Japan and buy these seals. I'm sure right now the seal can flip around because that was years. Who knows what the seal does now? But the catch was the eyes, so expressive, so tender, so kind, and that was it.
That's very nice. And on that note, I want to thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Barral. It's been a very educational conversation. I hope all listeners got something out of it. I'm sure we will probably be talking with you again sometime in the future.
My pleasure. I hope everyone get a little bit better knowledge of what is Alzheimer's and the really effort that science community is trying to do. Thank you for inviting me.
As we close, I want to thank you for joining me on the Her Notebook podcast. I hope today's conversation brought you some knowledge and sparked new insights. If you enjoyed this episode, I humbly ask that you please remember to click the subscribe button below. Until next time, keep flipping your notebook pages and embrace the journey to a healthier, happier you. See you next week.